think this is a really important thing about translation, is that I'm not there to serve the author or serve the text. I am there to interpret it. So no one knows who Duna is. They use this like avatar that's like a rabbit. And so whenever I think of Duna, I think, oh, it's a rabbit that writes novels. And Counterweight actually came from this idea that they wanted to create this script for a movie, a science fiction movie. It wouldn't quite work as a movie script, and so what they ended up doing was creating it into a story and then a novel, and that is the novel that we know of as Counterweight. And Counterweight is about a space elevator, an elevator that goes up to space. And it's kind of like the cable for the elevator is held taut by the centrifugal force of a counterweight at the other end of the cable, which is like orbiting Earth, basically. And mysterious things happen surrounding the space elevator. And the key to this mystery lies inside the counterweight. I think a lot of people have this idea that translators only translate. And I guess it's understandable because it's in the name. A lot of the times, translators discover the books. And this means we have to read a lot of books in our source language, and then we have to kind of determine what project we want to work on. And we kind of find the book, and we do a sample, and then we look for a publisher, and then we negotiate with the publisher and with the rights holders. And so there's a lot of like behind the scenes work that is involved with translation. And translation is actually a very small part of what we do. It's maybe like, I always say that it's about like 30 or 20% of what I do during the day. Everything else is emails. It's basically an email job with translation attached to it. Books come to us in a variety of ways. Until 2022, right before I got nominated for the Booker Prize, I basically found my own books and had to create my own job every time. And the way that I would do that is I would have to look for a book that I knew that would not be translated by someone else, that some translator who wasn't more famous than I am would like swoop in and take away from me, because that's happened a few times. But after 2022, basically, I became the most famous Korean translator, and I became the person that people would come to with books, like publishers or agents would be, oh, we have this book and we sold it or we're about to sell it, like, can we put you on as the translator for the book? And I would say yes. It used to be that I would have to hear the English of a text before I choose to translate it. That no matter how beautifully a book is written, if I can't quite hear it in English, then I'm very reluctant to take it on, because I feel like then the book hasn't chosen me. But now I am a little more adventurous, I guess. And I like to have a book where I don't hear the English. And so I could kind of like keep exploring and keep experimenting with different voices and try to see how the book and I can kind of like meet halfway. I am like a violinist or a pianist. Like, I'm not Mozart, but I am Sarah Chang, or, I'm Hilary Hahn. Like, I am interpreting the work in my own way and creating music out of it and creating literature out of it. And that's kind of like the attitude that you have to approach any work with, any source text with, so that you find a voice for it, basically. People think that I'm like best friends with all of my authors. There are authors that I've never met. And there are authors that I've never even like emailed. Like, we have never been in contact. So how that works is basically I have this thing where I feel I only go to an author if I don't understand what they're saying. And that means either, I'm not a good translator, or the author is not a good writer. And so I feel like I'm a pretty good translator, but more importantly, all the authors that I translate are the best. They're excellent at writing. And so I never feel like when I deal with my authors that I have to ask them any questions. It's very clear to me what my authors intended and why they would create certain illusions and create certain moods and vibes and use certain words. And I try to interpret that and replicate that into English. And so for the most part, I don't need to know my authors. And so Duna is kind of like the, kind of that idea taken to its natural conclusion, because no one has met Duna, no one knows who Duna is, no one talks to Duna, although we have talked to each other on Twitter. But I have to be very, very careful with my authors, because I don't want them to think that, oh, their writing is bad, and I don't want them to lose confidence in me as a reader or as their translator. I get stuck on things almost never. So the reason why I would get stuck on a translation is if I don't have the voice yet. And I have to then it's like a fun problem to solve, as long as I'm not on a dramatic deadline, where I have to really, really think about what the author sounds like in Korean and how they would sound like in English. And a really neat little hack that you can do for this is you can ask them who their favorite English writers are, who their favorite writers that write in English and that are translated into Korean. And for example, one of my authors, Sang-Young Park, he told me that he really likes David Sedaris and Chuck Palahniuk. And so I was like, oh yeah, you do kind of like sound like that. And so I used their voices to translate him, and it just worked really well. So with Duna, with Counterweight, I think what was really helpful was that when I learned that it was actually intended to be a script for a movie, so I thought, oh, I need to kind of like be very cinematic about it. And I need to also gloss a lot. Glossing means when you explain something within the text. So you don't use footnotes, but you kind of have to slip in these like words and slight descriptions. It could just be like a word or two. It doesn't have to be like an entire sentence, where it explains and contextualizes what's going on a bit more better, so that it's a bit richer. And so there was kind of like a lot of that going on with this particular book with Counterweight. But I think that goes on. That's not because Duna did not write a good novel. Of course, this is a terrific novel. It's beautifully written. But any translation where you're moving it from like one language to another, you really need to gloss, and you really need to kind of localize it a bit, so that things that, you know, work really well in Korean, like they may not work as well in English. And so I think that's a very, very necessary step to in the translation process. So David Foster Wallace wrote this essay about television, I believe, in the 90s. And he prophesied that someday there will be a culture that is completely devoid of irony. And so if it's so devoid of irony that it is exactly what it is on the surface, and this culture will swallow up the entire world. And it has come to pass, because the thing about K-pop is that it is exactly what it is on the surface. The thing about K-drama is that the plot is exactly what it is on the surface. There might be subtext, but the subtext is really not the point. It's just that here are these archetypes, like the mother-in-law and the daughter-in-law, and they don't get along. And so K-drama has like this very predictable, but very comforting in that predictableness quality. And so does K-pop and the more successful forms of K-culture. And the reason Korean literature is not as popular as K-drama or as K-pop is because Korean literature is not like that. Korean literature is very ironic sometimes, and Korean literature has many layers, and it doesn't adhere to David Foster Wallace's prophecy. And so while I'm very much aware of how popular Squid Game is and good for them, literature, not so much. It's there may be like 10 books being published a year that are Korean, and a good year, maybe 15. It's always my mission, and I do have a mission as a Korean literary translator, to change people's conceptions of what Korean literature is. For a very long time, institutions like the Literary Translation Institute of Korea have pushed works that are they kind of lean conservative, and they're about like the same topics, and they're by the same people. And the thing about this book is that it just throws all of that out the window. It's science fiction. It's by an author who is completely unorthodox, and the story is completely unorthodox. And the way it's written is, in Korea we call it like it's a bit like impolite because not everything is explained all the time, and so it's a very idiosyncratic work. And it's always been my mission to showcase the different sides of Korean literature and the edginess of Korean literature. And I think this book really just like exemplifies all of that. And it's very edgy, it's very fresh, and it's a very different take on, you know, colonial literature, science fiction, Korean literature, and that's what really excites me about this book.